Imagination. In order to renew the force and feeling of this work, we must return constantly to fundamentals as the source. Previously, it began by recapping one of the foundation works, namely that work, in its practical application, begins with self-observation. However, when the work says we must begin with self-observation, we cannot assume that we already know what is meant by this term. Self-observation has great depth of meaning. People sometimes say, "Oh, yes, all this is nothing new to me. I have always observed myself." And yet they remain just as they are. Why? Because they imagine that they already know everything about themselves, and so have no need for self-knowledge. All this is illusion and sheer imagination. To imagine one knows oneself is to remain enslaved to one of the powerful illusions that keep humanity asleep. So let's then speak for a moment about imagination. Everyone imagines they know themselves. However, the peculiar thing about imagination lies in this fact: that if we imagine that we are something or have something, then we no longer wish for it. For example, if we imagine that we know ourselves, then we will not seek to find out how we can acquire self-knowledge, and so will make no real attempt to practice self-observation. We will both take ourselves for granted, and imagine that we know ourselves adequately. We then go about behaving as we always have, imagining that we do everything consciously. In that case, we will never be able to establish the inner struggle between yes and no, which is the basis of practical work on oneself and the source of change of being. It is difficult to discern even a single thing about oneself, and this is due to more reasons than one. For example, the whole natural movement of ourselves must be turned completely around, in order to facilitate self-observation. Naturally speaking, we look out through our external senses at whatever aspect of the world they register, according to their very limited powers. This external scene, registered by sense perception, full of people and things, brightly colored, we suppose is the sum total of what we call the real thing, or the existential, which is in brief our reality. Which is different for everyone. Reality, however, is not confined to the very limited range of our five senses, and does not only lie outside of us, in the spectacle of life. But there is also a reality of our inner thoughts, feelings, desires, and sufferings. In other words, there is a reality even more real to us than any external reality transmitted by our senses, and which can only be penetrated by each individual themselves. Outer reality is generally speaking common to us all. Inner reality, however, is individually approached. This other inner reality, to which each person has their own access, lies invisibly within us. It is to this invisible inner reality in which we dwell psychologically, or psychically, which is our inner confusion that this work applies to. Science initially turned outwards, via the senses, seeking ways to conquer nature. Only recently, through investigation of neurosciences, and the work of individuals such as Dr. Joe Dispenza, are we beginning to discover physical proofs of what was known and taught by the ancients. This work is about conquering oneself, about self-mastery, and so begins with observing not external nature, but oneself. However, let's be honest, all kinds of psychological difficulties arise here, and in this regard we all possess defective vision. Insight as distinct from outsight. One of these chief difficulties is due to our power of imagination. We imagine that we see ourselves and know ourselves thoroughly, so this prevents us from awakening to the realization of what real self-observation means, what it really means to begin to know oneself. Remember too that self-knowledge from the most ancient times was regarded as the highest knowledge. All esoteric teaching speaks of self-knowledge. So let's revisit again the work speaking to us about imagination, and the part it plays in life, preventing us from changing our being. The work says, there are 1,000 things which prevent us from awakening, which keep everyone in the power of their imagination and dreams. In order to act consciously with the intention of awakening, it is necessary to know the forces which keep us in a state of sleep. First of all, it must be realized that the sleep in which we all exist upon this earth is not normal, but hypnotic sleep. Man is hypnotized, and this hypnotic state is continually maintained and strengthened in us. One would think that there are forces for whom it is useful and profitable to keep humankind in a hypnotic sleep state, thereby preventing us from seeing the truth and understanding our position. There is an Eastern tale which speaks of a very rich magician who had a great many sheep. But at the same time this magician was very mean. He did not want to hire shepherds, nor did he wish to erect a fence about the pasture where his sheep were grazing. The sheep consequently wandered often into the forest, fell into ravines and so on. Then above all they ran away, for they knew that the magician wanted their flesh and skins, which of course they did not like. At last the magician found a remedy. He hypnotized his sheep and suggested to them first of all that they were immortal, and that no harm was being done to them when they were skinned, that on the contrary, it would be very good for them, and even pleasant. Secondly, he suggested that the magician was a good master who loved his flock so much, that he was ready to do anything in the world for them. Then in the third place he suggested that if anything at all were going to happen to them, it was not going to happen just then, at any rate not that day, and therefore they had no need to think about it. Lastly, the magician suggested to his sheep that they were not sheep at all. To some he suggested that they were lions, to others that they were eagles, to others that they were men, and to others that they were magicians. Then after this, all cares and worries about the sheep came to an end. They never ran away again, but quietly awaited the time when the magician would require their flesh and skins. This tale is a very good illustration of man's position. In so-called occult literature, you may have met with the expression Kundalini, the fire of Kundalini or the serpent of Kundalini. This expression is often used to designate some kind of strange force which is present in us, and which can be awakened and should therefore be sought after. However, none of the known theories gives the correct explanation of the force of Kundalini. Sometimes it is connected with sex energy and tantrism, with the idea of the possibility of using sex energy for other purposes. This latter idea is entirely wrong, because Kundalini is not anything desirable or useful for our development. It is curious how these so-called occultists have got hold of the word from somewhere, then completely altered its meaning, and from a very dangerous and terrible thing, they have made something to be hoped for, to be waited for as some sort of boon or blessing. In reality, Kundalini is the power of the imagination, the power of fantasy, which takes the place of a real function. When someone dreams instead of acting, when their dreams take the place of reality, when someone imagines themselves to be an eagle, a lion, a man or a magician, then this is the force of Kundalini acting in them. Kundalini can act in all centers, and with its help, all the centers can be satisfied with the imaginary instead of the real. A sheep which considers itself a lion or a magician, lives under the power of Kundalini. Kundalini is a force put into humanity in order to keep us in our present state. If we could really see our true position, and could understand the ultimate horror of it, then we would be unable to remain such as we are, even for a second. We would begin to seek a way out and quickly find it, because there is a way out. But humankind fails to see it, simply because we are hypnotized. Kundalini is the force that keeps us in a hypnotic state. To awaken for anyone means to be dehypnotized. In this lies the chief difficulty, and in this lies too the guarantee of its possibility, for there is no organic reason for sleep, and we can awaken. Theoretically we can awaken, but practically it is almost impossible, because of the psychological forces acting upon us. As soon as we awaken for a moment and open our eyes, all these forces that caused us to fall asleep begin to act on us with tenfold energy, so we immediately fall asleep again, very often dreaming that we are awake or awakening. There are certain states in ordinary sleep in which a person wants to awaken but cannot. They tell themselves that they are awake, but in reality they continue to sleep, and this can happen several times before they finally awaken. But in ordinary sleep, once we are awake, we are in a different state. In hypnotic sleep the case is otherwise. There are no objective characteristics, at any rate not at the beginning of awakening. Someone cannot pinch themselves in order to make sure that they are not asleep. Only an individual who fully realizes the difficulty of awakening can understand the necessity of long and hard work in order to awaken. In this dialogue we can see how much importance is attached to imagination, and in what sense it is used. Imagination is therefore defined in this work as that which replaces reality. Imagination can satisfy all centers, so we are satisfied with the imaginary instead of the real. There are dopamine studies which illustrate this scientifically, spoken of by Robert Wright, in his lectures on Buddhism and modern psychology at Princeton University. It is for this reason that the work so often speaks about imagination, and the necessity for struggling with it. In the practical instructions given by this work with regard to what one must struggle against, imagination is mentioned. However, it usually takes considerable time before a person in the work begins to observe their imagination. And there are also many difficulties connected with observing imagination, one of which is that as soon as we try to observe it, it stops. That is, as soon as we get into directed attention, imagination ceases. Few individuals have reflected upon how they would care to face the possibility of the whole of their inner psychical life of secret thought and feeling being suddenly laid bare to the observation of other people. Here, in our life on earth, this is mercifully hidden from others. However, at the same time, it is individually accessible to each of us. This is the direction of the work on its practical side. To see, through directed uncritical self-observation, what exists in oneself, what thoughts, feelings and so on, that we identify with. In the self-observation of a work sense, it is necessary to observe facts about oneself. Most of us unfortunately excuse ourselves, and so are very much under the pleasant and subtle activity of self-justifying, in conjunction with imagination, and we never really register any distinct facts about ourselves. For example, if we are mean, we really do not observe it as a fact. Others may observe this, however we find all sorts of reasons to excuse it. Take yourself from the perspective of how you speak or think unpleasantly about someone else. We do not register this fact through direct and real self-observation. We allow it to go on, chiefly because we like it and it's so very easy. Then if we're called out on it, we probably smile in that terrible way we do at such a time. Why is everyone so incapable of registering facts about themselves? One great reason for this is that imagination of the self prevents us. We cannot see anything real, any real facts about ourselves, save very dimly. Our imagination, or state of hypnosis, prevents any real, direct observation. We imagine we are, say, eagles or lions, even respectable and nice people, so cannot see through the mist of self-imagination that we are nothing of the sort. Yet all of these ideas, all of these forms of imagination under which everyone lives, are but different examples of Kundalini, and the force it exerts on humankind, to maintain the state of sleep that characterizes all of humanity upon this earth. People are not what they imagine themselves to be, nor is anything in life what it pretends to be. Certain people may begin to see that this is so as they get older, but then, just when this work becomes necessary for them, as a rule they become negative and feel frustrated. It has been pointed out that the work teaches that we are in the power of imaginary I, and that this is the source of most of our troubles. This I, or this feeling or idea of oneself, is composed of imagination. Do not think, however, for a moment that imagination is nothing. Nothing but imagination, as the saying goes. We have all heard what the work says about imagination. It is the most powerful force acting upon mankind, and so a definite and a terrible thing, not a mere nothing to be swept aside. To say that a person is suffering from imagination is to say that that person is suffering under the influence of a very powerful, intractable and dangerous force. Apart from what has been shared here about self-observation, its meaning and objectives, this can now be added. One of the objectives of self-observation is to break down imagination of oneself, that is, imaginary I. One is not what one imagines oneself to be. Imagination, too, has no real memory. Self-observation is to create a special and real memory, a conscious memory, a memory that imagination cannot escape from. Self-observation is to destroy imagination, to create a memory that fights with unreal, sentimental and imaginary fantasy. If we only possess the unreal memory of imagination, then we live in the ideal fantasies of imaginary I, and never see that anything is wrong with us. Others are wrong, not us. But what are we really like in ourselves? What eyes control us? What eyes govern our lives? What eyes do we consent to? Can any of us bear to break ourselves up into different eyes, then see what they say and do, what they think and feel? This is to break up the power of imagination, to register unpleasant facts about oneself. Can you move upon the surface of your own waters, as it says in the account of the beginning of personal esoteric work, in the first chapter of Genesis? Walk on water as Jesus did in parables. Remember how our ordinary state of sleep is described, and the earth was waste, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." What is light? What is the lamp unto your own feet? It is esotericism, it is esoteric ideas. It is the ideas of the work, which is esotericism. When a person who has right magnetic center first meets the ideas of this work, they are in themselves, the earth that was waste and in darkness. Self-observation carried out sincerely from the knowledge of the ideas of this work, lets light into that inner darkness, this inner chaos of oneself. That is how self-observation is defined in the work, for it says that self-observation lets the light into oneself, then adds that many things can take place in darkness. Just like certain chemical processes which cannot take place in the presence of light, and light is consciousness. This is the beginning of that possible inner transformation that all esoteric teaching, including the Gospels and this work, refer to through the centuries. Having spoken of self-observation from the standpoint of some of the greater ideas of this work, let's now reflect upon it on the scale of which the last segment was shared. Previously, amongst other things, it was noted that to observe oneself it is necessary to divide ourselves into an observing and an observed side. That the feeling of I or consciousness must be given more and more to the observing side. Which means, observing I must be given as far as possible, the feeling of I in the moment, and the observed side given the feeling of not I. We walk about in life observing houses, people, objects, trees, and so on, but do not necessarily connect the feeling of I with them. They are not I to you or me. The self-same division must be made internally. What we observe internally is not I, in the same way as the houses and people that we observe externally are clearly not I. We are not identified with everything we see outside of us, but ordinarily are identified with everything that takes place inside us, with every thought, mood, desire, and so on. Self-observation in the work sense is to separate observing I from what is observed in oneself. For instance, we can observe the emotion of the beginning of anger. We can observe the thoughts connected with it. If our consciousness of the feeling of I is stronger in observing I than in what it observes, then our anger and the thoughts accompanying it will not have full power over us, the whole inner event may simply die away. Suppose now that some self-justifying I comes onto the scene that claims that our anger is right. What then happens? Answer that for yourselves, and if you have never really observed yourself, then you will not be able to answer. But if you have, then you will know exactly what happens. However, the difficulty mentioned already remains, simply that everyone imagines he or she is one person, a unity or monism, and cannot accept that they are not one person at all, then everyone imagines that they know themselves. It requires long work, great sincerity, and particularly great evaluation of the work and its meaning, to realize that you are legion, not one, but many eyes. Even our very pride will prevent us, unless we feel the existence of something greater than our pride. The doctrine of many eyes is a stumbling block to everyone. Yet it is true, and is the secret that begins to make change of oneself possible. Remember too that if we identify with an I in us, we give it force, and we give it the sanction of ourselves. That is, we sign its checks in our name. Surely some must recognize unpleasant or rather, evil-minded eyes. Then if we identify with them they become who we are. We will them. As soon as we extend our will to possess something, as soon as we take something into our desire, then it is the same as ourself, and so it works in us as ourselves, and we believe it. Now we can ask the question, how can we make use of the observations that we have made on ourselves? This is a question for next time, and something worth reflecting upon.